Thank you all. I'm delighted to be here, listening to at least the end of the last presentation about fear. I have to kind of confess that I'm coming here with some fear, and that is, after hearing the last presentation, my fear is that you're not going to find what I have to say interesting. So I'm going to do the very best I can to interest you in what I have to say, and hopefully to create some engagement so you can give me your thoughts and ask me, of course, any questions you have. I actually just want to make a comment. I spent the last, close to the last week in Toronto, and hearing the last discussion about Europe compared to the United States, I will say this. Wherever I go around the world, I always talk to taxi drivers to get their sense. I get a sense of the community. And I'm a native New Yorker, as you heard from the introduction, but you talk to New York cab drivers and there's anger. You know, there's sometimes racism expressed, depending on the cab driver, there's hostility. And I have to say, and I love my country, as I'm sure you all do, but I have to say, having been in Toronto, I talk to every cab driver and they love the multiculturalism of Toronto. They love the way they're treated. I don't know, are you from?
We're both from Canada. I'm from Vancouver and she's from Montreal.
Oh, great. So it was just amazing to me how not only enamored with the culture of the city and the country, but just how nice the people were. Now I'm sure there are exceptions, but it was pretty much an interesting generalization that I was able to extrapolate from my experience there. So when I received the invitation for this event, which was actually articulated as addressing the humanitarian crisis in Syria, my first thought was, what could I possibly add, or what could I say that would anyway help the Syrian crisis? I really do wish I had the answer as to how to end that war and address the devastating humanitarian crisis that's resulted, but no way that I can. I don't have any of the answers, but I do hope that at least by looking at some of the lessons learned from my organization's experience, which has been 40 years of helping businesses resolve disputes, some ideas can be applied to the current crisis. And just like in my career where I came to realize that engaging in endless litigations rather than searching for solutions is totally crazy, choosing war over mediation in a war-ravaged humanitarian nightmare is truly madness. I know that there have been many efforts to mediate in Syria, and you may have read about them, and they've all failed. But as you know, and as all mediators know, that's not a reason to give up. Just a few words about me. You heard about my background. I was at MasterCard actually almost for 30 years. I joined the company when I was 12. No, I'm kidding. But I love the company and I watched it change over the years. And one of the things amazing about MasterCard is how global we were. We have products sold in more countries than you can buy Coca-Cola. And so we had a share of disputes and negotiations around the world. And I have to confess, you heard my background, I came to the company with a litigation mindset as a former trial lawyer. But after years of observing truly destructive litigation, and not only my company, but the entire industry, and the fractured business relationships that result, I really became convinced there had to be a better way. And in the end, we did resolve almost all of our disputes via mediation. And I really truly came to believe that mediation was the answer. And it also led me to realize that it's not only about mediation, it's about being sensitive to cultural differences and whether those differences be ethnic, geographic, or anything else. So people often ask me, because I left a major company and joined a nonprofit 501c3 organization that's focused on dispute resolution, what actually drew me to the organization. And the organization, the CPR Institute, was actually founded 40 years ago oddly enough, by general counsels. Those are leaders of companies, lawyers that are leading companies, and they were all just soured on litigation, and they wanted to find other ways to address business differences. And find ways to preserve relationships rather than go into these kind of long legal battles. They wanted to find ways to resolve disputes that were really based more on interests of the parties rather than legal rights. And so what is it about CPR? Well, CPR is a unique organization. There are organizations that have mediation and arbitration, but CPR is a think tank. It's always been focused on finding new and innovative ways to resolve disputes. We've got hundreds of members around the world and over 500 mediators and arbitrators in our network. And one of the first things CPR did back in the 80s was create a pledge. And that pledge was simply a document that said, we commit to not running to court. If we have a dispute, we'll try to work it out amongst ourselves, generally through mediation. It was really created to address what is this fear of showing weakness. And the fear of showing weakness, I think, transcends the corporate environment. Everyone's afraid of showing weakness. As I understand it, and you may have read about this, I did, the Saudis, by indicating that the Saudis, no, I'm sorry, this is talking about the recent breakdown in negotiations between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And what happened is those negotiations broke down. And they broke down because the Saudis got the impression that Qatar was indicating that they were the ones pushing for the mediation. And they were, as the New York Times reported, insulted by the suggestion they had bowed first in the dispute. And the whole negotiations broke down. We've been actually preaching for a long time that mediation and suggesting mediation, if anything, is a sign of self-confidence and strength, not weakness. And I think that we had over 4,000 companies sign the pledge, and the pledge was adopted all over the world by other organizations. So that's kind of helped us, I think, start the drumbeat, moving towards mediation. We've worked around the world, focused on two things: creating a culture for mediation and the capacity for mediation. And probably the best example is the work that we've done in Brazil. Is anyone here from Brazil? Brazil is famous for its litigious environment. People from the United States think of the United States as litigious. Brazil has a backlog in the courts of like 15 to 20 years. There are more than, there are two lawsuits, there's a lawsuit for every 2 Brazilians, and that counts children. It's an extraordinarily litigious environment, and some people attribute it to the Brazilian competitive personality. So recognizing the need, we went to Brazil and actually created all kinds of awareness sessions and congresses and trained mediators and did programs in the schools. And as a result of that, mediation has become accepted in Brazil where it previously wasn't. And it's actually changing slowly the litigious environment. But I think the most impact we've had is actually in corporations. The traditional approach to disputes in corporations was seeing business disputes as battles and litigation as war. And we try to change that with a pledge, but also to teach companies how to focus on thoughtful business resolutions. And so what they did was we taught companies how to introduce dispute resolution programs, how to evaluate a case, and think about mediation from the very beginning of any kind of conflict. And this resulted in massive financial savings, improved business relationships. And one of the things that we found that was interesting is companies were always afraid that if they settled the case, especially public companies, their stock would plummet. But I think what we realized was, and they realized, is that the market actually values predictability. So if you take some kind of risk off the table, the stock actually ends up doing better. One of the best examples was involved the agricultural industry. Companies like Bayer, DuPont, and Monsanto had decades of really ugly litigation in intellectual property and antitrust. And at one point, one of the leaders at Monsanto decided that he was going to try to bring an end to this. And so he actually brought all of these companies together at the most senior levels and decided that they would try to come up with a way of dealing with each other and create an atmosphere of trust, because it's all about trust. So they brought the senior leaders together and they sat down and they came up with ways to address, using CPR, my organization's processes and our mediators, they came up with a way to address disputes using the relationship that they had fostered from getting together. And today, as we sit here, from a situation where they had massive acrimony and lawsuits, there are no lawsuits anymore. So it's just an example of how an industry can change if it actually becomes much more thoughtful in terms of litigation. Now, there's been a lot of writings on how to break an impasse, how to make people work together, and how mediations can be most effective. I believe from our experience that there are some key contributors to a successful mediation, and I think this has application to Syria or any other global conflict as well. And my idea today, my premise, is that the lessons from the success of commercial mediation have application to situations like Syria and other conflicts around the world. One of, if not the most important way to resolve a conflict is to pick the right mediator. From my reading, as I understand it, one of the challenges was that some of the efforts in Syria didn't work because the parties didn't believe that the mediator was truly neutral. So you need a mediator that's absolutely viewed as impartial. One with credibility and experience, listening skills, someone who has that relentless pursuit of finding solutions, obviously patience and a thick skin. And I'd also add diplomatic sensitivity and cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skills. Another issue that I think was articulated for the failure in Syria was timing. It's very important that a mediation happen not too soon, where there is a multitude of open issues and not a clarity as to what the mission is, and not too late, where the parties have entrenched positions and it's just very difficult to unlock them. The problem is these pages are stuck together. Okay, getting the right people to the table. As I understand it, there was always an issue in terms of the players in Syria. There were external forces and who should be there. So getting the right people to the table and making sure that the wrong people are not at the table to the extent that you can possibly do that. Ensuring all sides are represented and have authority to resolve a dispute. Avoiding over-inclusiveness. What do I mean by that? It's there's always an effort. Everybody wants to be at the table. And there are always many, many factions, so you have to make sure that you pick the right participants and the right representatives. And finally, I think on the right people front, getting a sense of who the influences are and who are the best partners to embrace an interest-based resolution. It's very important that there be a process that the parties agree upon and there be collective ownership of the process. And as we talk about in mediation, the most important thing is probably having the parties understand that the benefits of a resolution exceed the risks of a failed mediation. They have to understand what's at risk and how important a successful mediation would be. Now, in my company, I managed many negotiations and mediations over the years. Probably the most significant one was a series of mediation sessions that led to agreement that resolved a big bitter dispute between banks, retailers, and credit card companies. And this was about merchant fees and whether the fees could be passed along to consumers. I won't bore you with the technical details of the case, and I'm also somewhat constrained from the confidentiality that all mediation processes have. But I can make a few observations about why that was successful that hopefully you'll find is of some value. In our case, mediators earned the trust of the parties, but they did this initially through individual discussions with the parties. They didn't bring us all together as a group until much later on in the process. The mediators focused on resolving some of the easy issues first, addressing the resolution and what I would say would be small, bite-sized pieces. There were disparate groups on each side, and they spent a great deal of time making sure and managing negotiations with each individual group to make sure that they were aligned. So when you think about a mediation, when you have multiple parties, you have to make sure that each of the groups is singing from the same sheet and having an aligned perspective. So they waited, as I said, to introduce joint sessions until an environment of at least some trust was created. They used techniques to reduce emotion, like jokes and humor. They took every opportunity to move the discussion away from legal rights to what the parties really cared about beyond money. What were their paramount interests? They evaluated the representatives to determine who amongst the group were the ones that would be reasonable, that would be transaction-oriented, and had enough influence to play constructive roles. We had actually 2 experienced mediators who worked well together, and they were able to deal with multiple groups simultaneously and create in what we would call complementary co-mediation. Now, this case really had a lot of consumer impact. The mediators encouraged both parties, or all parties, to think about how customers would be impacted. We were talking about introducing pricing and surcharging at the point of sale. The mediators focused the parties on to figure out how to avoid damaging the goodwill of all the participants in the negotiation, and thinking about how the customers would be impacted. And this led all the parties to realize that they all had a common interest. They didn't want the interest of whether it be the retailers or the banks or the credit card companies to be tarnished in the minds of consumers. So they had that commonality of interest. I'd say that negotiating a peace agreement is different than negotiating a settlement agreement between businesses. There's no question. And in Syria, there was enormous, massive distrust, and continues to be, and external influences like Iran and Russia and the United States, et cetera. And peace negotiations between neutral intermediaries or using neutral intermediaries have been taking place for decades. And I'm not suggesting that commercial mediation is more advanced or sophisticated, or that mediators in commercial cases are more skilled than those that have attempted to resolve the Syrian conflict. In fact, we've heard from George Mitchell, who was considered one of the great mediators, mediated the conflict in Ireland, and others, and they've shared their experiences with my organizations. But what I really believe is that learnings from commercial mediation related to critical matters that I've mentioned, like timing and picking the right mediator, could be of real value in helping parties make the right decision and ultimately opt for mediation, rather than madness. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you in terms of why I think it's so important that mediation constantly and continually be utilized to solve conflict, whether it be in business or whether it be in war or any other avenue. And with that, I want to open it up to questions and comments, and or we can talk about anything else you want.
I just wanted to say I appreciate you sharing with us your perspective of mediation, because I guess in a way, cultural diplomats are mediators, right? So it's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, thank you for that. It is true. When we did a program on cross-cultural mediation, mm-hmm. and it really is, at the end of the day, culture plays a critical role in understanding. I remember the first negotiation I did in China, in Beijing. It was a long time ago, and I was completely oblivious as to, I learned about presenting your business card and some of the basics, but no one ever told me how to actually deal with an interpreter. And whether you look at the interpreter or the person who is being interpreted, and something
how do
like
you do
that,
that?
if you're unaware, becomes a real challenge.
Especially in China, where they're very often they use the translation also to distort the process sometimes, because either they choose simultaneous translation or sometimes the consecutive is a way of delaying the process as well. So
Absolutely.
you need to be aware of all these tricks.
Yes, and there are so many differences in terms of the lack of formality that Americans have versus the Chinese, and you really can turn off the other side if you're not aware of how you're coming across.
Thank you for your candor. I have two questions. One of them, don't you think that New York taxi drivers are becoming quieter and quieter? And the second one is how do you choose choose an influencer, and what are the qualities of an influencer? Because that's something that I gravitate towards, because sometimes when I'm trying to mediate or trying to get a project forward, I'm usually picking the non-influencer that's not going to be able to progress the project. So what are the qualities of an influencer, and how do you spot?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll start with
The taxi drivers.
The taxi drivers. So I find that every once in a while you'll get a taxi, and I'm obsessed with getting these guys to talk. So and it's one of my few core competencies, I think, is getting cab drivers to open up. But every once in a while you find a cab driver that's quiet and doesn't want to share his or her view, and you can get them off the cell phone. And by the way, is there any other country where all the taxi drivers are constantly on their phones when they're driving you around? That's definitely
Especially in China.
a New York thing. But you basically, I have found when I open the conversation with pleasantries, and whether it inevitably turns to politics and Trump. I mean, it's all about Trump. You can't actually travel anywhere if you're in America without talking about Trump. And of course, since most of us in New York will never defend him, you do find a sympathetic ear on the other side. But I'm not going to get into politics today. But I do find that it's an interesting group, because it's you can get kind of a base view from cab drivers all over the world, and New York cab drivers will open up, and some of them actually can be really friendly. But there is, I think, there's a sense of more anger, frustration, and really unhappiness that you see, which I find very disturbing as an American and as a New Yorker. Your second question was about identifying influencers. And that's one of the reasons I think when you're mediating a case, it's really important to kind of have, well, I'll give an example. I was going to say to have a sense of the players. In a business environment, in a commercial case, let's say I'm mediating an employment case, you'll have the employee on one side, the employee who has usually been terminated, and the company. And the company will have like the head of human resources, will have an in-house lawyer, they'll have the head of the business unit, there might be 4 or 5 people involved. And as you get to know the individuals, first you kind of get a sense of who you think is easiest to deal with. And then you have to kind of stop and say that's not enough, because they have to have the authority internally to be able to influence the other players, because they all kind of get a vote. It's not usually the CEO of a company that makes a decision whether to settle. It's the lawyer and the head of human resources, et cetera. So, and it really differs from company to company. So you kind of see them interact with others, and watch the body language. Are people taking them seriously? Are they listening? Are they influencing them in terms of the discussions with you? So it's not only who does the talking, although sometimes that's important. So it's a number of those kind of factors that you can kind of help you evaluate the strength and the influential capability of an individual. Hopefully that answers your question. If not,
Then it's about the co-opting of that, and how you co-opt the influencer to take on your issue or take on your side.
Yeah. Well, it's, the classic mediation is, and this is an oversimplification, but you go to one side and you kind of highlight, the weaknesses of their case or their side, and you do the other thing with the other side, and eventually you kind of, have the parties, realize that, they have something to lose. That's kind of an important, that's not an unimportant component in any mediation. But the real, I think, the most important component is to really kind of understand what the interests of the parties are and what they really, care about.
Yeah.
And I think once you can do that, and then you kind of piece it together with who are the significant influences, players within a certain organization, and then you can actually, and sometimes you can even have I was going to say a one-off, an individual meeting with them and say like, look, I think you get it. You may have some people in your organization that you're going to have to convince, and but I think we can get there, and we can resolve this case together. But I need your help, and it's almost like deputizing someone to be your representative in terms of their individual discussions. It's kind of an interesting, and every case and every dispute is different, but oftentimes, ensuring that you found the right party or persons that can kind of play that role is very important.
So, what do you think is the main reason why commercial negotiation is a success, as you just said, and on the other hand, we have like the dispute settlement aspect of the negotiation? Is it because there are a lot of states involved? What's the main reason why it does? I think it's not working with all what has been going on. What can explain that?
Well, that's a great question. There are some, if you think about the Middle East and some parts of the world, there are really very, very, I'd say, intractable disputes that exist. The degree of difficulty is extraordinary. But I do think that, some negotiations, or many negotiations, don't have a third party. I mean, it's pretty basic in negotiation to recognize the advantages of having a neutral third party, play a role. It's happened in some negotiations, and many of them actually have been successful, but a number of them have failed. And the reason I think some of them fail is, not having the right mediator, as I mentioned, the timing is off, and you really need to be relentless. I mean, as a mediator, you have to have the kind of personality that leads you not to give up. Because, it's very easy to kind of say, okay, I'm frustrated, you guys are so far apart, you'll never resolve this thing, you hate each other, I'm going home. I think, that's not the way a good mediator works. And, but it's hard, and sometimes, you have to find the right time or the right message to get through to the parties.
Just if I may say something. Well, first thing, I really would like to thank you for this presentation and also for sharing your personal evolution, I would say, professional evolution. While you were speaking, I easily imagined you as a very aggressive litigator, and then all of a sudden, you picture yourself as someone that is pleading definitely for mediation as the way everything, the conflict should be solved. And I cannot agree more with you on this conclusion. Just for you to understand my background, I work for the European Union. I've been working on conflict management first for several years, and I could tell you a lot about the backstage of the management of various conflicts in the world and the way the European Union has tried to play a role in those conflicts, either by being a mediator or by being present at the table when the mediation was at stake. But one thing I wanted to tell you is one thing that you said that was absolutely key, and that I don't see in many of the conflict prevention policies that are developed by being the UN or being the European Union, is I think that it is not highlighted enough the will to preserve the relations. This is the first thing I've noted down in your presentation. I think many countries or many conflicts forget this aspect, and many mediators forget to underline this. So for me, it's absolutely key that we focus on the understanding of the advantages of preserving relations. I think it's not a surprise for you if I tell you that most of these processes are also based on political gains and immediate gains. So this is why also, I mean, I see a difference, a huge difference between public and private disputes, because, I mean, public very often look for immediate gains.
Right.
But as I said, I mean, from your explanation, I would take home this, is the importance of making the parties understand the importance of preserving their relations and the benefits they will get from this. Instead of getting into a dispute, I mean, convinced that the best way is that one dominates the other, or that one interest prevails over the other. So this is what I wanted to say.
No, thank you. I think it's a great point. One of the things that we're working on, actually, and I think it's pretty innovative, and it's a fairly recent initiative, and it has nothing to do with litigation. It really involves, there are so many, joint ventures between companies, whether it be a technology partnership or a purely commercial arrangement. Two companies come together, and they basically, in essence, create a third company, and it really is a challenge. I think about 2/3 of all joint ventures fail, and one of the things I observed was that when companies come together, they form all these committees. They'll have a technology committee, a regulatory committee, a product development committee, any number of committees. There's never a focus on identifying problems and figuring out ways to address them early and mitigate them and avoid like a full-blown dispute. So one of the things that we're working on are processes to use like dispute resolution expertise early on in a commercial relationship so that the business relationship can stay together. So it's almost a preventative kind of effort. And one of the most interesting ways of going about it is to actually have what people refer to as a standing neutral that is actually introduced into the relationship from the beginning, so that this person, she or he, will understand the players, the issues, what's important to the relationship, and have periodic meetings with the parties to ensure that there aren't any conflicts. And it's a great way of actually, putting on the table issues, because the earlier you can identify a problem, the more likely you're going to solve it. And more companies are actually, thinking about this as a preventative way of avoiding, conflict. It's, your point is so correct. It's the very reason my organization was formed, because these companies are saying like, we're going to all, your adversary today could be your partner tomorrow, could be your merged, partner. I mean, the world changes, and making enemies, we learned that when we were kids. It's not the best way to go, and that's what makes litigation kind of crazy. But so is war.
And recognizing difference as the neutral, and recognizing man's primitive tribalism as inherent in their humanity.
Yes.
Because we are by nature parochial and all those things, even though we think we're not.
We all like to think we're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe we're all a blend of some of that and
higher thinking, but recognizing the difference and
yes.
finding that neutrality.
Okay, any comments from this side of the room? Any questions?
I was just wanted to ask about your Brazil anecdote. Was that at the invitation of the Brazilian government that you went there, or how did that?
Yeah, well, actually what happened was, we had several of our companies came to us and said, we'd like you to focus on Brazil. We have most of our litigation there. We're spending a lot of money. Every time an employee leaves, they sue us. I mean, it's just a terribly litigious environment, and we can't. Nobody thinks about resolving cases. Nobody thinks about mediating. So we went, and then we actually did. We garnered the support of the judiciary and the government in Brazil. And now when we hold congresses, we usually have somebody from the Brazilian government speak, so a judge will speak. So we've gained the support of the Brazilian community, which is it's really fulfilling to see how that's grown and changed.
Well, thanks so much.
Okay, well thank you for listening. I appreciate it.